Adversary, Shifters Forever Worlds, Always After Dark, Book 3. Written by Elle Thorne. Narrated by Megan Kelly. Chapter 1. Lion shifter Mark Martinez pushed through the crowd, ignoring the appreciative glances the Dallas ladies were sending in his direction, disregarding the admiring looks at his ass as he passed, not paying heed to the ones who surveyed his package and his wide chest and broad shoulders. He was on a mission. He wasn't here to hunt pussy. His lion growled as if to say, "You say that like there's something wrong with pussy." "Yeah, right. As if you'd ever want pussy anyway. You're waiting for our mate." His lion growled again, as if there was something wrong with waiting for their mate. "Nope, not a thing." Mark couldn't argue with that. There was nothing wrong with wanting to have the right woman, the only woman, a mate who would be his forever. He'd given up on that, though. Now one thing garnered his attention: business. He was only interested in furthering Martinez's interests and income. Right now, Mark Martinez of the Florida Shifter Territory was hellishly pissed at the Tieros shifters of Dallas. They were having a council meeting, their first since they'd moved to this continent, and they weren't inviting the Martinez family. That was an insult that wouldn't be suffered lightly. He'd rained down his anger on them as soon as their meeting started. His mission was to trespass on the Tieros territory and to violate the sanctity of their precious towers by barging into their council meeting. He wouldn't mind a peek at Sanctuary, the unique environment created for shifter relaxation, and a bit of nature in the middle of Dallas. The shifter relaxation place evidently wasn't open to Martinez shifters. Mark scoffed at his exclusion from their precious sanctuary and sneered. Maybe he'd even have casual, meaningless sex in their damned sanctuary, just for kicks. His lion grumbled, though he knew damned well Mark didn't do casual or meaningless sex. "Shut the fuck up!" Mark's temper flared. Damn if his lion didn't always call him out on shit. Wildly enough, the ladies were now looking at him with even more interest, as if the dark side of him was something they'd like to tame. He'd pity them if they saw his dark side. In and out of bed, he could be voracious, insatiable, and rough. Mark kept walking past, his mind on Sanctuary, After Dark, the council meeting, and the Tieros family in general. He'd heard Sanctuary was a glass and metal bar enclosure that took up the whole 43rd floor of Tieros Tower 1. A bevy of caves and tunnels gave visiting shifters space to roam and hide. Above the caves and tunnels, the shifters, in their werecat forms of course, enjoyed jungle habitat, including oversized boulders. Tieros Tower 1 and Tieros Tower 2 were side-by-side buildings, built for, owned by, and managed by the Tieros. 5 glass-covered walkways connected the buildings, allowing occupants to travel from building to building without venturing outside. The towers ranked amongst the most extravagant and coveted buildings in Dallas. Where the hell was his brother? Mark and Mason were supposed to be going to the Tieros Towers together. Mason still hadn't called. Mark took his phone out to make sure he hadn't missed a call. Nothing. Was Mason ducking out of this on purpose? Just because his ex was going to be there? This was business. Exes were exes. The two shouldn't intersect. They were at cross purposes. Mark forged on. He'd do this without Mason if he had to, though 2 lion shifters were always better than 1 when facing a room full of other shifters who weren't on the friendly side. Mark shoved the phone back in his pocket and proceeded forward, long strides covering a lot of distance. Blocks away, he could see the tall Tieros towers, glowing gold as the sun reflected off their windows. Mark Martinez was always up for a challenge, regardless of the odds. "Let's roll." Chapter 2. I'm going to need more chocolate." Tigress shifter Veila Tieros grimaced at the thought of her curves and how tight her dress had been before she'd shifted into her tigress form. She was a white tigress, which many of the Tieros tigers were, taking after their father, currently the most notorious tiger shifter in Europe. She was going to need a lot more chocolate if her father was coming to town. Word had it their father and an uncle or two were flying in from Europe to attend the shifter council meeting. Her brother Vax, Vittorio, Tieros, had called. Veila got up from her favorite boulder in Sanctuary, stretched, and craved more of the chocolate her half-sister Lila kept them stocked with. She'd have to shift and leave Sanctuary to get some. Since her apartment was out of her favorite chocolate, she'd have to raid Lila's stash. She used to just roam in and out of Lila's apartment without asking permission or knocking. Hell, they all did. But Veila couldn't do that anymore. Lila was busy with her new mate, a massive Siberian shifter she'd met while helping out with a territorial matter. Veila shifted into her human skin and tugged her outfit into place. Shifting was a surefire way to make her clothes look like she'd been playing a sport. Or having sex. Jeez. Yeah, right. She didn't know how long it had been since the last time she'd had sex. It was too damned hard to find the right man, it seemed. "You're too picky," her sisters all told her. She laughed that off. Veila had been sure she and Lila wouldn't be finding mates anytime soon. She'd enjoyed the good times they had together. Sure, things were still good, but now she had to share Lila with Sai, her Siberian mate. Veila had to admit he was hunky, just not her type. She wasn't interested in love right now. She had a career to worry about. She wanted to take over a territory of her own. She had a lot to prove to her father, a man who didn't seem to favor treating his daughters as equals to his sons. She scoffed. She could handle anything any male could. She slipped out of Sanctuary and down the staircase into After Dark, the club her brother Vax ran. Partiers from far and wide made After Dark a must-see on their visits to Dallas. After Dark was known around the country as one of the more high-end nightclubs, rivaling those in Europe. Sanctuary was the largest draw of their customer base at After Dark. All those humans just had to come see the tigers. Though Veila didn't understand the mystique in the draw, she was more than happy to make bank. Cutting across the club, she had one objective: chocolate, preferably dark, with a dash of tiny crystalline particles of sea salt. She took the elevator down to her apartment, passing Lila's on the way. She closed her hearing off, choosing not to let her super-sensitive tiger hearing catch any X-rated sounds Lila and Sai might be making. Her phone vibrating on her hip pulled her up short. It was a text from Vax, asking if the executive boardroom was ready. She made a quick U-turn, her stomach in knots. The thought of having their father visit put everyone on edge, but mostly Vax, since he had broken Tieros code and taken a human as a mate. She sighed. She was close to Vax, so if something bothered him, then it bothered her. She fully supported his choice in a mate, and if someone asked, she wouldn't be shy about voicing her opinion. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Voicing her opinion wouldn't bode well for her. She'd checked the boardroom herself because everything needed to be perfect. The Tieros needed the shifter community in America to take this branch as seriously as the European Tieros branch was taken by the European shifters. Hell, while she was at it, she'd also check on the visiting shifters and make sure their needs were being taken care of. Deep in thought, she walked across the uppermost glass walkway that spanned Tower 1 and Tower 2. The visiting shifters were all staying in Tieros Towers 2, all of them in floors below the boardroom where the shifter council meeting would be held. Tieros Tower 1 housed the Tieros siblings, as well as Sanctuary and After Dark. Her phone vibrated again. She looked at the screen. Lila. Without a greeting, Veila jumped right in. "Bring chocolate," she told her little sister. "Lots of it. I have a feeling we're going to need it at this meeting. Mind if I take a pass? I think you and Vax can handle this. I was going to go with Cy to take Petra back to school and get her situated. What? You can't leave me? No, Dad could be coming. Then Veila got it. You little witch. You're going because you want to avoid Dad. Aw, come on. That's not fair. You're leaving me, Vax, and Sophie to deal with Dad. That's so messed up. Chapter 3. In the executive boardroom on the top floor of Tieros Towers 2, Veila stood at the windows looking out over the city. The setting sun showcased the beauty of Dallas. Greenery overflowed in a city that boasted technology and money. She turned toward the door when she heard it opening. Vax closed it behind him. He was alone, his face serious. Veila wondered if he had the rumor of their father's visit on his mind. She couldn't let it go. Being sent a continent away from their domineering father had been just what they'd needed. Vax had been near a breaking point until their uncles Tito and Federico had suggested the two move to America and secure some territory there for the Tieros family. Having their father so close to them again was bound to bring up old wounds for Vax, and what hurt Vax hurt Veila. "Where's Lila?" Those were the first words out of his mouth. "And Sophie?" "Lila's going with Cy to return Petra to Chicago." Cy's sister Petra had spent a month recuperating in the Tieros Towers. She was the victim of a kidnapping and had been destined for a cage fight until she was rescued last month. Now she was ready to go back to college and resume her life. Vax nodded, as if he wasn't surprised he'd have to fight the battle with one less ally. "And Soph?" "She's not answering her phone. I'm sure she'll be here." But Veila wasn't really sure at all. The door opened again. Lazar Arsenault held the door open for his sisters, Alexa and Evie. Veila hadn't met either of them, though she'd heard a lot from Callie. She had met Lazar once, in passing, about a week ago. It still flabbergasted her to learn she and Vax had cousins here in America, from their mother's side, that neither she nor Vax had ever known existed. The most their father had said was to stay away from New Orleans Arsenault. She'd never thought to question her father. Then again, she'd never questioned her father, not about anything, and she tried too much to be an ideal child, hoping one day she'd measure up in his eyes, knowing that being a female was an automatic setback. Her cousin Alexa had dark auburn hair like Veila. She was easy to pick out based on Callie's description. Callie was particularly close to Alexa. The two spent a lot of time together while Vax and Lazar were talking business. Evie was typically out of town when Callie had been at the Arsenault home, so Callie hadn't shared much about her with Veila. Lazar didn't have a chance to close the door before he was followed in by the Bear Canyon Valley shifter, Grizzly Jake Adams, typically referred to as Doc. May Forrester had accompanied him to the meeting. Veila didn't know many shifters who weren't acquainted with May. May was the widow of Grizzly shifter Brad Forrester, killed by other shifters many years ago. May held the Bear Canyon Valley shifters together, bringing new shifters in, trying to keep her husband's dream for Bear Canyon Valley alive. She was a stunning beauty, though more than 100 years old in shifter years. Her mate's couple bond mark had kept her young, and she didn't even look 30. Vax had certainly made connections since coming to America. Veila had been so busy with numbers and running her part of After Dark, she'd missed out on meeting these shifters. She looked at her older brother, a glow of pride warming her body. He was the perfect choice to build the Tieros interests here in America. May hugged Veila. "Your brother has said so many good things about you. He's ready to watch you take your own territory." Veila glanced at Vax, knowing his tiger hearing enabled him to hear what May just said. "Where were you planning to send me?" She softened her question with a smile. She didn't want to leave Vax. He was her best friend the way Lila and Sophie were best friends. And even though Vax had Callie now, the two of them were still as close as they'd ever been. If anything, Callie augmented the siblings' solid relationship. A pair of wolf shifters walked in, identical, muscular, with short blonde hair. She knew who these two were, Rory and Reese Nielsen, but she didn't know which was which, and she wasn't sure she'd be able to tell them apart even after she was introduced to them. They gave Vax a shoulder hug. One of them leaned closer to his ear.
"The Raffertys are taken care of."
Vax cocked his head, a question in his eyes.
"'Nuff said,"
the other Nielsen wolf twin said. Vax nodded. The Rafferty shifters were the ones who kidnapped Petra and later Lila. Whatever taken care of meant, Veila hoped it was a death sentence. Wondering if Sophie would make it to the meeting, she checked her phone again for what might have been the 30th time to see if her sister had texted. Nothing. Not a word. Was she that busy getting things set up at after dark? Veila looked around the room. This should be it as far as out-of-town shifter attendance went. Oh hell, except for the rumor her father and two of his brothers would be coming in. Veila and Vax hadn't told the European Tieros they were having a shifter council meeting, or they would have wanted to make it a regular occurrence. The European Tieros, translation, the old-school Tieros, would not have liked that. They didn't like the intermingling with other species of shifters, whether as friends or mates. They were totally against taking humans as mates. Veila wondered how she'd managed to deal with growing up in such a restrictive, close-minded society. She credited her mother with giving her and Vax an easy acceptance of diversity of all kinds. Veila hoped she and Vax had managed to rub off on Lila and Sophie since they had a different mother. Veila's father had remated right after their mother had died. That union had produced Raphael, usually called Rafe, and two girls, Lila and Sophie. The shifters all took a seat at the large mahogany table.
"Thank you for coming to what I hope will be the first of many meetings while we all work together to—"
The door opened. Opened was an understatement. Veila flinched at the force with which the door was flung aside. In the entrance stood a handsome, if arrogant and hard, face and a broad set of shoulders leading to a wide chest. The chest tapered to a waist that boasted a lot of time in a gym. The striking stranger was a lion shifter, that was evident. Black hair, ebony eyes, a dark tan, and a strong jaw. Veila tried not to stare at the perfectly sculpted set of lips offsetting the hard look on his face. Something in her stirred. Her tigress. She purred deep within Veila, reacting to the man's lion. What the hell? Veila had never been the lion type. Like you've had any experience with lions or any other shifters. Her tigress scoffed at Veila. Veila bit back an urge to tell her tigress to shut up. The man locked eyes with her. Suddenly, it was as if no one else was in the room with them, as if no one else was in the world with them. Her breathing slowed, synchronizing with his. The lion's pulse sped up, matching hers. She couldn't tear her gaze from him. She knew Vax was saying something, but it sounded like distant thunder, indistinguishable and faint. A second lion shifter joined the first, a brother, she could tell, even if she couldn't see it in their features. From what Veila understood, everyone who should be here was already seated at the table, and she had no doubt her information was accurate and up to date. Vax would have told her if he'd arranged for anyone else to attend. So who were the two lion shifters? Actually, who was the first one? A loud gasp tore Veila's attention from the lion shifter. The gasp came from Lazar's sister Evie. She stared at the lions, her face having gone ashen. Her eyes were wide and tear-filled. Veila looked back at the lions. The second lion's face had gone from stoic to concerned to pain-filled, his eyes glued to Evie. The first lion's grasp on her attention lessened as Veila brought herself back to the situation at hand.
"Was my invitation lost?"
Her lion's voice washed over her, leaving gooseflesh behind. Had she really just thought of him as her lion? Chapter 4.
Martinez,
Lazar said with a frown.
Arsenault?
The lion shifter replied. Evidently his last name was Martinez, a name that meant nothing to Veila.
This is an interesting turn of events,
the second lion shifter added.
A meeting without the Martinez tribe? I suppose that shouldn't surprise me, Lazar.
Lazar rose. Though his pulse indicated he wasn't agitated, she wondered if he was extremely adept at hiding it.
And if you'd had an invitation?
Lazar's accent was clearly American, but also very different from the ones Veila had become accustomed to in Dallas.
Look at what would have ensued. Drama. Such is the drama we have now.
A pulse raced in the room. No, Veila decided. 2 pulses raced. She glanced about at the occupants. Tears streamed down Evie's face, silent tears that emphasized her beautiful blue eyes. Veila surveyed the rest of the shifters. The other racing pulse belonged to the second Martinez lion. Then Evie managed to blurt out, "Excuse me," and slipped out through the second set of double doors. The doors didn't close behind her. Gavin, head of Tieros security, strode in, his predatory eyes taking stock of the situation. 8 shifters followed him, and Veila glimpsed more waiting in the hallway. How the hell had Gavin known to appear, and so quickly? The first lion gave Gavin a once-over, took note of the number of reinforcements he had, and made a wise choice to stand down.
Looks like the party's over.
His eyes locked with Veila's again, and she felt that tunnel feeling happening once more, sucking her into a place where only the 2 of them existed.
For you, it is.
Vax's voice was cold.
Detain them. We'll deal with them later.
Veila was happy the lion shifter didn't put up a struggle. The idea of Gavin's team hurting him, or even killing him, bothered her. The lion shifter walked out, no argument, not another word. Watching the muscles bunch up in his arms, Veila was certain he'd have inflicted his share of damage on Gavin and his team. She found herself even more relieved he hadn't objected to being detained. If he'd maimed or killed a Tiero tribe member, then he'd never have a chance to be... To be what? Her tigress interrupted her thought process. I don't know. All she knew was she wanted to get to know him better. Her tigress purred in agreement. No! Veila wanted her tigress to take control of herself. Surely this wasn't her mate. He was a lion. She shook her head.
You okay?
Vax put a hand on her shoulder. Fine. Just curious about who those 2 are. I'm going to check on Evie. Alexa rose with a pointed look at Lazar. How did they know we'd be here? Did he know Evie would be here too?
No clue.
Lazar resumed his seat, running his fingers through his hair. They all took their seats, but the room was quiet while everyone absorbed the scene they'd just witnessed. Lazar cleared his throat.
Evie and Mason Martinez used to be together.
Vax nodded. Veila wanted to say that was obvious. It was also obvious they still cared for one another. Curiosity would have normally risen in her about them, but at the moment, there was only one thing that piqued her interest.
What's their beef with us?
Veila asked.
Why did they care enough to barge in on our meeting? You don't know the Tiero Martinez history?
Lazar cocked his head, a surprised look on his face.
Does your family make it a practice to keep everything from you? First that we are related, and now this?
Veila glanced at Vax. They were in agreement. This all stemmed from their father. Why did he hoard information?
Your great-grandmother jilted a Martinez. This was back when the Martinez were looking into an expansion from Spain into Greece and Italy. She fell in love with a Tieros.
Lazar laughed. Veila wondered what about that struck Lazar's funny. Vax had told her that if there was anything worth knowing among shifters on the American continent, Lazar knew it. It looked as if he was well acquainted with shifter history in Europe as well. Lazar continued.
Long ago, the blood feud was exactly that. The Martinez tribe sought to avenge their pride by killing the Tieros. The Tieros retaliated. They almost caused a shifter civil war between the tribunal set forth rules. The primary one being that revenge couldn't be the kind that drew blood. The Martinez made it a goal to thwart Tieros business interests. End of story. Why the hell don't we know about this?
Vax's jaw was clenched, his words forced.
Where are the Martinez now? The American ones are in Florida and Puerto Rico. The rest are mostly in Spain.
Veila and Vax had known about the Martinez when they lived in Europe. They just hadn't known about the history. Why did their father keep so many things from them? Vax adjusted the collar of his shirt, running his finger along the inside.
Enough about this. Let's get on with the meeting.
Veila wondered if Vax planned to call their father on this omission of information the next time they had a conference call. Veila wished she could say she paid attention while Vax and the rest of the shifters in attendance discussed tribe alliances, business, and who knew what else. She didn't. She couldn't. Her attention was inwardly focused on a lion shifter with kissable lips and a hunter's eyes that she couldn't get out of her mind. What were Vax's plans for the shifter? When everyone stood, she realized she'd daydreamed through the whole... She glanced at her phone to see the time, 1.5 hours. Vax gave her a look.
What's up?
Just thinking about a sexy lion and why I've never been attracted to another man like I am him.
About?
It figured Vax would ask that.
Business.
As in, none of yours. But of course, she wouldn't say that. God, when had she started being so secretive? She and Vax never kept secrets.
Lunch? Anyone? I'll get the kitchen started on it.
She couldn't fool her brother. They were too close. As she walked away, she glanced back. He was still watching her. Chapter 5. With the kitchen busy preparing meals for those in the boardroom, Veila grabbed a tray and headed toward the 18th floor, the floor set aside for Gavin, his team, and 2 detaining cells. She opened the door to the room holding the cells without knocking. A part of her felt like a fraud because she wasn't here on Tieros business. She was here on Veila business. She had a personal interest in the lion shifter. One cage was empty, the other held both Martinez shifters. Gavin sat at a table nearby, a cup of coffee at his fingertips. "How are our guests?" she asked Gavin. Near her, the shifter called Mason gave a self-deprecating laugh.
Guests.
His voice may have been low, but the sarcasm in it was very evident.
Leave her be,
the other lion shifter said. Mason's head snapped toward his brother, but he said nothing.
Can I have a moment with them?
Veila asked Gavin.
As long as they're in their cages and you don't get too close.
He pointed toward the tray in her hands.
What's that for?
Them. She indicated the lion shifters with her head.
Does Vax know? Never mind.
Evidently, Gavin had seen the look on her face and thought better of asking her. It was a good thing, too, because Veila was not in the mood to deal with that. She didn't answer to her brother. After Gavin closed the door behind him, she set the tray on the table next to the cage and dragged the table a little closer. 2 sandwiches wrapped in deli paper were on a plate. She reached out to hand her lion shifter one of the 2 sandwiches the kitchen had prepared for them.
Is it poisoned?
He had a slight smirk on his face, but not an unfriendly one. Always. Veila let a small smile drift over her lips. I heard blood is not to be let, so thought poison would be appropriate.
You know of the history,
he said, taking the sandwich from her. Their fingers touched, his overlapping hers.
Broke Gavin's rule of not touching, didn't you?
She kept her grip on the sandwich, letting her fingers stay under his. Gavin doesn't dictate policy to me.
Who does?
He raised a brow. The gleam in his eye was wicked as he studied her face, his gaze moving down from her eyes to her lips. Veila held her breath for fear the butterflies this man was giving her would try to escape through her mouth. No man had ever had this sort of effect on her. No one does. She tried to move her hand away, but his fingers tightened around hers and the sandwich. He pulled her a step closer.
No mate?
It was as if he were a snake charmer, make that a shifter charmer, and was charming her. She couldn't look away or put any distance between them. She shook her head, acknowledging she had no one. A gleam appeared in his eyes, and the barest hint of a smile rose on his lips. She found herself happy he felt this way, the feeling expanding in her chest. Her tigress's purr grew louder, threatening to overtake any sounds Veila would be able to hear. Stop it, she told her tigress. I'd like to have a conversation with him. The purring subsided, though it didn't disappear completely.
I'm Mark. Mark Martinez. Your tigress?
How the hell did he know? She nodded slightly. I'm Veila.
My lion, too. How's Evie?
Mason's voice broke the spell between them. Veila turned his way. The shifter's eyes were full of pain. Alexa went to check on her.
Any chance I could get an update, if there is one?
The hurt in Mason's eyes was raw. Veila couldn't deny him that. Sure.
Why weren't we included? Is it because of the old history?
Mark asked. The man was too good-looking for his own good. A part of Veila wanted to strip him slowly and enjoy every inch of his body with her tongue. Damn. Her thoughts were going into X-rated areas, and she better quell that, or he'd be able to smell, see, feel, and know. She swallowed her desire for him, and was successful enough to speak a sentence without croaking like a toad. I wasn't part of the invitation committee.
Who was?
My brother, maybe. Lazar, too, I suppose. I'm not exactly sure.
Ah, then it was probably Lazar because of Evie,
Mark added.
What's your role here at Tieros, then? Other than being a Tieros princess, I mean.
The magical spell between them broke. Wow. You're a hostile bastard, aren't you? Maybe he wasn't any different than any of the rest of the males in her family or anywhere else. Tears stung her eyes the same way his words had stung her heart. She had a meeting to get back to. Chapter 6. Veila took a moment to compose herself. She didn't know why Mark's words had gotten to her the way they had. She added a little powder and blush, something to hide the misery his words had left her in. How could a stranger do that to her? Why wasn't he a stranger? Why had she felt an instant connection to him? Forget him. She had a meeting to get to. Keep telling yourself that. Her tigress's voice reverberated in her head. Keep pretending he doesn't matter. She opened the door and entered the boardroom. Relieved her seat was near the door, she slid into her chair and picked up a fork, even though eating was the last thing on her mind.
All good?
Vax asked, though his tone made it sound as if he knew something was very wrong. She nodded and nibbled on something. She looked at her plate. She wasn't even sure what she was tasting. After washing it down with a drink of water, she looked at May. I'm glad you could make it to Dallas. Vax has been talking about you so much. He said I should visit Bear Canyon Valley, that it's beautiful.
It is, but then I'm not impartial. We've got a bed and breakfast you'd love. Kelsey runs it. She does a wonderful job. There are so many shifters there, it's like being in a shifter town. Almost.
May's smile was nostalgic.
Brad, that's my husband.
May took a deep breath.
He was my husband. He passed. It was his dream that we get the valley back to its shifter days more than 2 centuries ago, when the valley teemed with shifters.
I'd love to hear more about it sometime. Veila found it hard to concentrate, though she was interested in what May had to say. When the door opened, Veila didn't look up right away. She fiddled with her food and thought about May's dreams for a valley full of shifters. And she was still very much plagued by a lion shifter with black eyes, a set of kissable lips, and a mouth that delivered a sting. It wasn't until she noticed the room was quiet that she looked up. The first place she glanced was Vax's face. His tan looked like it had faded in a matter of seconds. His eyes had a blank zombie-like stare to them. She turned toward whatever he was looking at. Shit! Their father. Giovanni Tieros, black-haired, black-eyed, as tall as Vax, equally wide, impressively formidable, one long scar splitting his left eyebrow and cheek, which boasted his prowess in fights. Oh, damn. Right there, large as life, Giovanni and 2 of his brothers stood in front of the open door, in the exact same spot where Mark and Mason had been. Giovanni stared at Vax as if he were angry. That meant he'd heard about Callie, and the shit was going to hit the fan. For a moment, a very long moment, Veila wished she had gone out of town with Lila, or stayed out of the way like Sophie.
What the hell has been going on here? We sent the Tieros to look after Tiero interests in the United States. And this?
Giovanni waved his hands at the assembled group.
Instead, I see this menagerie of species, a circus show of freaks.
The shit was definitely hitting the fan. Veila wished she could duck, like right under the table, or run, or hide.
Hello, Father.
Vax's words were chillingly spoken. Chapter 7.
Fuck.
Mark gripped the bars of the cage tightly. God damn it. He'd upset her. He hadn't meant to. He was being a smartass, but clearly it hadn't gone over very well. He should have been more sensitive.
You like her a lot.
Mason pointed the obvious out. Mark was going to say, no shit, Sherlock, but he bit back the smartass comment.
What do you think the Tieros are planning? All these shifters here. Not sure, but what's interesting is they're not all tigers. That's very different for them. Add to that the rumor Vax has taken a human as a mate. Seems like it's a new day for the Tiero tribe, doesn't it?
Mason grabbed the sandwich sitting on the plate and unwrapped it.
Club sandwich? She's a good woman.
His words were lost in the bite he was trying to chew.
Yeah,
Mark agreed. She is a good woman. And he'd hurt her. Damn, he growled, not realizing for a moment he'd said it out loud.
You and I have a penchant for that, don't we?
Mason said.
What?
Mark wasn't sure what he'd missed.
For saying the wrong things to our women. Probably at the wrong times, too. Are you talking about you and Evie? What happened? I wondered why you've never said a word about your breakup.
Mark tried to pay attention to Mason and what he was saying, but in truth, he couldn't get his mind off the expression on Veila's face. If any other man had ever made her wear that expression, Mark would have killed him. But he was the man who'd put that look on her face and hurt her.
I don't feel like talking about Evie.
Mason ground the words out.
Okay. I thought you were trying to.
Mark pulled on the cage, yanking on metal bars that would never give, no matter how much pressure he applied.
I've got to get out of here. I've got to talk to her. I fucked up. Here she is, clearly going through some shit, and I just added more shit to it. You want to get out of here?
Mason asked. The way he asked made Mark want to punch his brother at first. Then he realized something.
You have your kit with you?
Mason had spent, or misspent, his youth staying out of trouble, an endeavor he wasn't very good at. He always used to carry a lock-picking kit. Mason patted his jacket pocket.
I don't leave home without it. You don't grow up with friends on the wrong side of the tracks without having something to show for it. Are your skills rusty? It's like riding a bike.
Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out the little kit Mark hadn't seen since their father had confiscated it the last time Mason got caught picking locks. Chapter 8. Veila held her breath. Think fast. She had to do something to defuse the situation. It seemed like she'd spent a lifetime diffusing situations between her father and Vax. Why couldn't father stop persecuting Vax?
You didn't tell us you were coming to town,
she said to her father, then immediately realized she hadn't exactly said what she should have or how she should have.
It seems my presence is needed.
Giovanni's gaze drifted around the table, from one face to another, not staying on any particular face longer than the others. His brows lowered into a scowl.
I thought you could control matters here, Vittorio,
he said to Vax, after his scrutiny had made the entire round of faces and finally come to rest on Vax's. Great. Her father was going with full names. A low growl came from Vax's chest.
You could have handled this with a phone call.
Veila didn't think Vax's voice could have gotten any colder, but it did.
I had to witness this decay of our codes and our standards myself,
their father said.
I did not want to believe a son of mine would conduct himself in such a manner.
Veila gasped. Giovanni had practically thrown down the gauntlet. Surely he didn't expect Vax to take this sort of an attack without reacting. Giovanni turned his gaze to Lazar while still addressing Vax.
Why is he here? Why didn't you tell us we had cousins in America already? They're no relatives of mine.
The older Tieros' words were clipped. Giovanni's voice had the impact of a guillotine blade. His manners, his words, this final pronouncement were more than Veila was interested in putting up with. There are mother's relatives, and your erasing her from your memories by taking a new wife before her body was cold does not mean we would do the same. She heard the sharp intake of her father's breath. She'd never been one to talk back. He turned laser deadly dark eyes on her, but didn't say a word. Veila fought the urge to squirm. She'd always been a good daughter, and this was not her typical M.O. She straightened her spine and leaned closer to Vax. She was with her brother on this matter, and on any other one. Giovanni's eyes narrowed. He nodded, not in agreement, but more like he was saying, "It's your bed, you made it, and you will sleep in it." Then he turned toward his younger brothers.
These are clearly their mother's children.
Uncle Tito and Uncle Federico didn't move. They didn't say a word for or against either party.
Why are all these species here?
Giovanni's glare focused on Vax once more.
Why are you here?
Vax crossed his arms over his wide chest, the muscles in his neck bunching, tendons showing. Clearly he was restraining his tiger.
I could not let you sully the Tiero name.
A tick worked in Vax's jaw.
Sully? How's that?
The tension in his voice and body was palpable. Giovanni raised a brow.
A human mate? Really? Do not say one derogatory word about her.
Vax put his hands on the chair in front of him, knuckles white, fingers straining, the leather creaking a protest. His warning was clear.
Do you believe this cub of mine?
Giovanni turned to Uncle Federico and Uncle Tito. Federico cleared his throat, putting a hand on his brother's shoulder.
Look, Gio, maybe we should go get an espresso? Let tempers cool. There are no tempers here. This is a business decision.
Giovanni shrugged his brother's hand off.
You're fired,
he said to Vax. His tone was crisp and sharp, like the creases on his Italian suit. Giovanni clapped his hands as if dusting them off.
Unless you want to reconsider your choices, all of them.
Chapter 9. Mark and Mason were free of the cage. They'd taken an elevator down to after dark and were blending in with the guests, humans and shifters.
That wasn't too hard,
Mason scoffed.
I should give the Tieros some advice on security and getting better locks.
He laughed softly.
Think they'd hire me to manage security? That's not quite fair.
Mark shook his head.
You're one of the best at lockpicking. They should have frisked your ass before they locked us up. True. Reconnaissance or home?
A curvy beauty ran through Mark's mind. Going home made more sense, really. Why should the Martinez be here when they weren't wanted? Clearly, the Martinez family would have an assortment of enemies now, the Bear Canyon Valley bunch as well as the Nielsen wolves. The Tieros weren't new enemies, but he thought the whole thing was silly. Who cared what had happened ages ago? Did that have to fuel future scuffles? Again, the curves, hips, ass, and blonde hair containing a Spitfire personality made tracks through Mark's mind and his lion's heart. He hated to admit it, but his heart and his lion's heart were one and the same. Sometimes it would be nice to have a separate identity, though he was glad he and the lion were so tight. It would suck to be one of those shifters who always disagreed with his lion.
Earth to Mark.
Mason elbowed him.
Home? Or are we staying? Personally, I'm voting for home. You go. Take care of things. I'll be along later. So I'll meet you at the hotel then? Sure, fine.
Mark didn't even know what he'd just agreed to because his mind was working on a plan to see Veila again. How the hell would he manage that? As soon as Tieros security found the empty cell, they'd be hunting Martinez lions. Ah, but they'd think the Martinez had left, wouldn't they? They wouldn't count on one staying behind. He had some exploring to do. All he needed was a good hiding place, and he had just the place in mind. Chapter 10. Veila knew her brother Vax. They'd grown up together after all, both children under the thumb of an overachieving, under-inspiring bully of a father. His old-school ways had threatened to defeat both Vax and Veila. Vax was more than just her brother. He was her best friend, had been the whole time they were growing up. He'd been her champion. Whenever her father had laughed and said she couldn't do something because she was a girl, Vax had stayed next to her while she tried and tried, even when hot tears came rolling down her face, burning her with a subtlety that entrenched in her the notion girls couldn't do what boys do. Vax was always there, cheering her on, believing in her. Veila knew her brother, and she knew the look in his eyes. Vax's eyes glittered with resolute determination. Whatever he'd decided, he wouldn't be swaying from it. He shoved his hand in his front pocket. She heard the keys jingling, then he pulled his hand out and held the keys up with 2 fingers. He held his hand out to Veila. Tears sprang to her eyes. "No." She mouthed the word, unable to focus on his face anymore because he was blurry through the tears. He pushed his hand closer to Veila, the keys jingling a death sentence. When Veila wouldn't take the keys from Vax, he set them on the table and strode out of the room, his tiger's walk graceful, proud, and unwavering. Gavin and his team followed Vax. As if not to lose control of the situation, Giovanni announced, "You are running things, Veila. Make me proud. Take the keys." Make him proud? All her life she'd tried and tried to make him proud, and she'd always fallen short. She was destined to never make him proud. Her gender assured that. "I need time." That was all Veila could say.
Time? Time to what?
Giovanni demanded. Time to think. I'll talk to you later. Giovanni opened his mouth, his expression stern. Federico and Tito put their hands on his shoulders.
Let's go for that coffee now, Gio. Let the young ones reflect on this.
Giovanni closed his mouth and let his brothers lead him from the room. Veila looked down at the keys, then raised her eyes. Lazar, May, Doc, and the Nielsen twins were still in the room. I'm sorry, Veila whispered. May covered the distance between them and wrapped her arms around Veila.
There's nothing for you to be sorry about. You did nothing wrong.
A sob escaped Veila. When a second one tried to slip out, she bit it back and sucked her sorrow deep inside. Vax is leaving. He can't go.
He has to,
Lazar said. Veila bit her tongue to keep from screaming at Lazar. It wasn't rational, and she knew he was right, but that wasn't what she wanted to hear.
We'll go check on Vax,
Rory said. Both wolf shifters made their way out of the boardroom, closing the door behind them. I'm calling Rafe. Veila had no idea how Rafe could help, or if he would, but as their father's favorite, maybe he could do something. Veila's phone vibrated on the tabletop. She looked at it. Sophie. Rage flared up for a brief second. Why did Lila and Sophie have to be gone during this time? Maybe if they'd been there, their father wouldn't have done this shit. She knew different, but a part of her couldn't help being angry at Sophie, even if it was only for a few seconds. She picked up the phone and pressed the screen to answer it.
What's up, Sophie?
You've got to help me, please. Now, Daddy's down here. He's here in the club. He's drinking, and he's saying stupid stuff, like Vax is gone, and you're running things, but he doesn't think you'll stick around. Sophie paused to catch a breath. He's freaking me out. Come down here and talk to him. Tell him he's talking crazy shit.
It's true. Vax is gone.
Veila bit her lip to keep the tears from coming back. The door to the boardroom opened. It was Vax and Callie.
Got to go, Soph. I'll call you in a bit.
Wait, Veila pushed the end button, disconnecting the call. Callie's eyes were rimmed in red, her pretty face swollen from crying.
I'll have my cell.
Vax hugged Veila.
No promises I'll answer it, though.
She held onto her brother's broad shoulders, burying her face in his neck, feeling not much different from the little girl who couldn't ride a bike without training wheels and kept skinning her knees while Vax tended to her wounds and told her he knew she could do it. Don't go, she whispered, loud enough for only his tiger to hear so she wouldn't upset Callie. He moved his head, one tiny shake that was larger than any earthquake would have been. The answer was clear. No. He was going. He'd had enough. Veila hugged Callie, the human who was now as dear to her as a sister. Callie took Veila's face in her hands. I'm going to miss you. You humans are so sloppily emotional, Veila said as her tears flowed freely. Callie's laugh merged with a sob. Vax led her away. Veila sat at the polished executive table and put her hands to her head. An hour later, she still sat there, numb, absorbing, thinking. Around her, the other shifters were silent, watching her. She could feel their worried eyes on her. I'm fine. She took a deep breath. It's going to be fine. If only she could believe that herself. Her phone vibrated. She looked at it. Gavin. What the hell was going on here? She didn't have a chance to say anything. As soon as she pressed the screen to take the call, Gavin began to speak.
The lions are gone. The cage, cell, is open.
Who'd let them out? Did Vax do that? She didn't want to recapture them if Vax had done this as his last act.
Let them be. But...
Gavin began.
No.
She pressed end. Chapter 11. Mark figured there'd be no better place to hide than in a large cat's natural element. He couldn't count on someone not doing a double-take if they saw a lion in sanctuary, but then again, that put the onus on him to stay hidden. Judging from the number of caves, tunnels, and alcoves and the amount of undergrowth, he didn't think he'd be easily discovered in sanctuary. The rumors he'd heard about the place were true. It did span the entire floor, and it was a mecca for meditation and relaxation. The humidity, the moat, the oversized leaves, ivy growing around tree trunks, large boulders to perch on, alcoves, tunnels, and caves to sleep and hide in. This was a haven for tigers. Even his lion, who tended to be claustrophobic in areas that weren't wide open, was almost purring from the ambiance in the green, shady-shadowed refuge. Sure, he was relaxing, but a part of his mind and all of his lion were in a state of alertness and plan-making. He would need to figure out how to find Veila without alarming anyone and having the cavalry, the Tieros security team, brought in. The sound of the waterfall cascading into the moat, which wasn't stagnant, but more like a lagoon, was lulling. Until he felt a heartbeat in there with him. He paused. It was too late to jump off the boulder, holding his large frame comfortably. Too late to hide. All he could hope for was the approaching heartbeat belonged to someone who was friendly to the Martinez, or someone who was ignorant of them. A white tigress hesitated, beautiful, graceful and regal, one paw raised mid-step. She cocked her magnificent head, her bearing inquisitive but not fearful. Her heartbeat remained steady, letting Mark know she was curious and not in the least concerned. He knew it was her the moment he saw her. His lion knew it before he did. The lion's attention was completely enraptured with her beauty. How could a beautiful woman like her make an equally beautiful tigress? He would have expected her not to be as glorious in her tigress skin. More often than not, this was his experience with shifter females. He felt the sync she created with him. Syncing was the way shifters could communicate silently when in their animal forms. They were able to talk to one another, using human language, silently. Sync communications could only be heard by those who were linked together. Once a sync was shut down by either party, the communication ended. Veila's sync pulled on Mark's senses, leaving a sensation much like a long, leisurely kiss. He'd synced with many shifters in his life, lovers and friends, but he'd never had this kind of sync connection. "Why are you here?" Her voice thrilled through the sync with ease, seeping into his soul. Mark rose, stretching to his full height, knowing many would be intimidated by his size. "Would you believe me if I said I was looking for you?" She tilted her head, and her ear twitched. "I would." She studied him, wordless in their sync, her eyes fully focused on his lion. "I wanted to apologize. What I said earlier was completely uncalled for, very out of line. I'm sorry." Mark still hoped she would believe him, believe in him. She had to. Her elegant whiskers moved slightly as if she were calculating. "Apology accepted. Would you believe me if I said I was happy to see you?" Mark pounced down, landing softly and soundlessly next to her. He shifted into his human skin. "It would make my day complete." Veila shifted into her human form quickly and effortlessly. Mark studied her. As beautiful as she was, she had a look about her. Like things were rough. It made the protector in him rise, eager to be her champion. "You look like you've had a day. Want to talk about it?" Her answer came quickly. "I want to talk about anything but it." Chapter 12. She could get lost looking at this man, lost in him, his lion, his everything. She stood there taking him in, muscles on top of muscles, but not in a bulky way. Dark eyes with a fire behind them that showcased his lion's passion. A perfect pair of sculpted lips, on a face that should have been on a model. Eyes that held a hint of danger and ruthlessness when needed. A jawline that was chiseled and square. Was she really lusting after this man when she'd just had the worst fucking day of her life? How could this man have such an effect on her? Her tigress rumbled low. Her fault. All the tigress's fault. Her tigress snarled, arguing the point.
What do you want to talk about, then?
The vision of male perfection personified asked. You. The word came out of her mouth before she could think. He cocked his head, a small smile playing on his lips. Don't let that go to your head. Veila grumbled, more embarrassed with herself than she was angry about his smile.
There she is. There's the Spitfire I thought I noticed.
He laughed.
I was beginning to think someone had taken your body.
His eyes traveled over her curves.
Not that it's a body any man wouldn't want to take.
A heat rose to Veila's cheeks. What the hell? I don't blush. This man's effect on her was crazy. The heat traveled from her head to her toes and throughout her torso. A buzzing sensation concentrated its effects in her panties, making her sex weep with desire. Her nipples tightened, and she was thankful he couldn't see them. Could he? She didn't want to glance down and draw attention to what he was doing to her. She took a deep breath and held it to keep her pulse in check.
Really, what do you want to talk about? I'm not a very exciting topic.
She didn't believe that for a second. She imagined there were women all over the place that would argue that statement.
I'll be the judge of that. For starters, why did you come to our meeting? The Tieros having a meeting on our turf? America has been our territory a lot longer than any of it has been Tiero territory. So that smarted. It brought back memories of things my grandfather used to tell me. Suffice it to say, I'm over it. It was foolishness. Ever done something stupid and then regretted it?
Like trying to please a father that you never could? Yeah, I think I know what that's about. She better change topics before today's events ruined her visit with this sexy man. So, why have you changed your mind? About Tieros and feuds?
Truth?
He reached out a hand and placed it over hers, his skin so warm it was almost feverish. Always. She looked at the large hand on hers, the way it covered her hand completely. He took so long to answer, she finally looked up at him. His eyes were the darkest she'd ever seen, as dark as his pupils.
You.
He curled his hand under and ran his thumb pad, rough and strong, over the tender skin on her wrist. Could he feel her pulse racing? It matched the butterflies ping-ponging along her stomach's walls. Had she ever felt this way before? When was the last time, if she had? You're a lion. Shit! She did not just blurt that out.
And your brother's mate is a human. What's your point?
Chapter 13. Mark sucked in a deep breath. He savored her scent, sexy, warm, along with a hint of her desire, as it filled his lungs, driving his lion crazy with a need to push out of his skin and make this woman see they were meant for each other. Was she trying to tell him to stay away? It was way too late for that. There wasn't a chance in hell he could steer clear of this woman or her tigress. He was trying to think of a way to convince her of the folly of trying to keep him from her life when he felt her gentle fingertip on his jaw. Her touch was so light, he looked down to be sure it wasn't something else. His lion snarled at Mark to seduce her, to hasten the process. Mark tuned the lion out, one of the rare times in his life he'd done that. He had to go with the timeline he sensed she wanted. He captured her hand in his and pressed her palm against his lips. He fought the urge to unleash his desire, to crush her to his chest and kiss her. To touch her lips with his and feel her body against his without the barrier of clothing. All her curves, nice wide hips to hold on to, offset by a waist that was just the right amount of narrow. His cock twitched. Mark grunted to contain it and his lion, hoping she hadn't noticed his reaction. He glanced at the lagoon to keep from thinking of driving his cock deep into her wet sleekness. A wetness he could scent, musky, sexual, female, Veila. She swallowed, the sound audible, her pulse loud in his ears. He wanted to cover his ears because hearing her reaction to him did nothing less than serve as a fuel, boosting his lust. When she slowly swiped her tongue over her lower lip, that did it. There's just so much a man can take. His voice was low, sex-hoarsened. He lowered his head, locking his lips to hers, the hunger and passion he'd been holding back demanding more from her, insatiable, combustible. His lion had taken control, done with waiting. Chapter 14. Veila loved his kiss. She'd never been kissed like this. She'd never known a man like Mark. His hands ran down her sides, and shivers followed the same path. He took hold of the hem of her top and tugged it upward gently, asking, yet at the same time, not asking. Was she really ready to get naked with this man? To do something she was not the type of girl to do. She'd never done the instant jump into bed thing. Yes. Her tigress hissed in her head. Was that her tigress, or Veila's subconscious? It didn't matter. The answer to that question was entrenched in her. Veila moaned her assent to the silent inquiry. She wanted to be naked with him, and so much more, so very much more. His lips left hers for the briefest of seconds while he pulled her top over her head. Before her lips could get cold, or her mind and body could protest, he'd claimed her lips again. He took control, helping himself to her mouth, her lips and tongue. His shirt rubbed against her as he pulled her closer, and at the same time pushed her into the tall boulder he'd been perched on. Turnabout was fair play, and his shirt was keeping her from his body. She grabbed the fabric, the obstacle keeping her flesh from feeling his, and tugged twice. In seconds, he had the buttons released from their holes and the shirt shucked and thrown into the waist-high bushes. When he pulled her back in, his chest and abdomen were warm against her tummy. A tummy she somehow wasn't self-conscious about when she was with him. Why didn't she worry about her self-image with him? Why did she not doubt the sincerity and the depth of his feelings? It wasn't like she was a wounded dove. She never had been. She simply didn't trust men, except for Vax. She put her hands on his chest and found his muscles flexed and hard beneath her palms. She glided her hands lower, feeling his abdomen contract. She raked her nails over the flesh, rewarded with a groan from deep within Mark, and seared into Veila's desire and center. She pulled back. She wanted nothing between them, and right now her bra was hampering that cause. Her nipples pushed at the lace fabric, painfully erect, painfully tender with a need for Mark's touch. Deftly, quickly, she unhooked it with a snap and peeled it off her creamy globes, enjoying the way his eyes dropped to her dusky pink nipples, enjoying the way her nipples reacted to his gaze, purling, buzzing with an excitement that traveled clear to her mound. Fucking amazing. He raised his hands, cupping the bounty that had filled her bra, thumbing her nipples roughly. The ache between her legs grew fierce, moisture pooling. His words and his tone set her off, skyrocketing the desire already building into a tornado-like sensation that demanded his touch. Except the words that came out of her mouth weren't a demand at all. "Please, I need you." Her cry was soft, almost begging. "You've got me. All of me." His own voice was more husky with passion than hers as he pulled her pants down, not bothering to unbutton them, ripping the button loose, sending it flying. Clad in panties alone, she stood waiting for him. He led her to a shorter boulder, then took his pants off and folded them. Seating her on the cushion they provided, he spread her legs apart, moving her full thighs with such tenderness she felt more moisture building. He leaned forward, inhaling, his chest filling with air. He was a sprinkled with hair, muscle-bound picture of maleness. His face close to her breast, he moved the short distance and took her nipple in his mouth, making her think of the waves that had crested in the ocean when she'd visited the coast during a storm. His scruffy beard was a rough caress that, when coupled with the sharp nips he was giving her tiny nubs, made voltage travel the distance to her clit, setting it on fire with an intensity that made her moan. "I have to taste your pussy. I need your sweetness to fill my mouth." He traveled his tongue to dip between her breasts, then scorched her skin when he traveled southward. Pushing her legs open even more, he stared at her sleek rosiness. He ran his tongue over his lower lip, almost throwing Veila into an orgasm at the idea of his tongue being on her, in her. He spread her open with his thumbs, and the coolness of the air touched her heated flesh, causing her to quiver. Mark lowered his head, his breath warm, countering the cool air on her pussy, caressing her lips. A shiver traveled the length of Veila's body. He pushed her back farther, his arms under her thighs, her legs hooked over his wide shoulders. She was fully exposed, and a feast for his lion vision, even in the dimness. Knowing he was surveying her entrance and enjoying the slick pink and redness he found between her legs, watching his face as lust traveled over it, making his dark eyes even darker, his olive skin flushed with desire. All of it was too much. Veila whimpered with a need for him. He blew on her clit, making it twitch, making her legs jump. "Please, Mark." "Please what? Suck your clit? Fuck your pussy with my tongue? Lick your lips? Bite your clit?" "God, yes, yes, please, damn it." Who was this woman? This demanding, sex-crazed woman? Who was she? Or was she simply Mark-crazed? He sucked on the swollen little button of her desire, then licked from her ass to pussy with a long, hard swipe of his tongue. He reversed course, letting just the tip of his tongue travel the same distance, allowing it to penetrate her entrance enough to create a whimper deep within her, which came out in a long moan. When the tip of his tongue touched the rosebud of her ass, she flinched and grabbed his head, bringing him closer and raising his face to her pussy. She gasped as he drove his tongue deep inside her. A rumble from his chest turned her on even more, drowning out the sound of the waterfall nearby. He plunged 2 fingers into her while he sucked on her tender, swollen bud and sent her into a frenzy. Nails digging into the boulder, fingers becoming raw from the effort, she thrashed as a climactic wave overtook her, sending her off a cliff of pleasure. Throwing her head back, she roared her pleasure, sure she could be heard throughout the entire floor. He rubbed her thighs, then climbed onto the long boulder, his body covering hers. She lay there, immobile and recuperating for a few moments. She panted and tried to catch her breath. "My turn." She locked her lips on his, taking control of the situation, and reached for his pants, cupped his crotch, and found a supersized hardness. Christ, he was huge. She stared into his eyes, their depths growing with an amber-colored light. She shimmied down his body and studied his thickness. His slit glistened with pre-cum as she lowered her head. She touched the tip of her tongue to the large pearl of moisture. Saltiness, maleness, and musk slid over her tongue, firing her desire all over again. She licked the rim of his mushroom head and was rewarded with a groan that grew into a large growl when she snugly wrapped her lips around his cock's cap. A slight sucking made his growl deepen and become more intense. Before she knew what had happened, Mark had hooked his hands under her arms and pulled her up his body, her pussy trailing over his thighs. With their lips locked in a kiss, she tasted herself while she straddled him, his cock tucked between her nether lips. She leaned back, pushing off his chest, and rose, preparing to glide onto his length. With a sudden drop, she speared herself on his shaft, his girth causing her to cry out, stretching her more than she'd ever been stretched before. She rocked on his cock, her breasts swaying temptingly close to his face. Mark reached out, grabbed her breasts, and fondled them, taking her nipples between his fingers and thumbs, tweaking them roughly, pulling on them and pinching them, then rolling the hardened nubs between his fingers. God, I love that. She rocked harder to match the desire he was building in her. Pressing on his chest for leverage, she pushed herself up, then slammed herself down on his cock again. Fuck. The word was long and drawn out. He grunted once, then flipped her. I can't do this. I need you. I need to fill you with every bit of me. Do it, now. Her words spurred him forward. With one fierce push, he was buried balls deep, his flesh slapping against hers mercilessly as he pummeled her pussy, filling her and punishing both of them with the intensity of his thrusts. I want to make you mine, forever. He panted the words out. Do it. I want you to. I don't want to complicate your life. I love you too much. I can wait. She didn't want to wait, but knowing he cared enough to wait for it to be the right time for her affirmed everything her tigress already knew about him and his lion. Veila shoved backward, taking him deeper, then used her legs to bring her forward, then back, meeting him thrust for thrust. Longer, deeper, faster. God, you're tight. The sounds of their sex, the slapping of skin against sweaty skin, the panting and grunting, her moans, his groans, all of it was becoming too much for her. Her final moan became one sound, long, getting louder, non-stop, almost a howl when she felt her body clamp down on his cock, her channel holding him tight, her body pulsing moisture out, making the slapping, slurping noises louder. With one fierce grab of her hips, he pulled her tight against him and stilled, while his cock pulsated streams of his essence deep within her. She gripped the rock, digging her nails into it, her head thrown back, her ass against him, as another orgasm rippled through her body, taking her to a new place, one where he already was. Chapter 15. You know why I didn't bond with you? Mark asked Veila. He wanted to be sure she understood what his motives and plans were. Her voice was hushed, as if she was tired and drifting. Both of them were still naked, lying on the boulder, and finally, Mark noticed it was heated. That's why they weren't chilled. They thought of everything when they designed this place, didn't they? He continued. I don't want you to feel like you have to rush into any decisions. I know you have a lot going on, what with this big meeting and all. She rose, planting her arms on his chest, looking into his eyes. She told him about her father's visit, her brother quitting, everything that had transpired. Holy hell. And she was down here with him. He didn't minimize what that meant to him and to her. What can I do to help? A hint of a smile crossed her face, but it wasn't a joyful one. Nothing. Interesting, though. Another look. Maybe it was trepidation crossed her face. I'm no different than Vax in my father's eyes. I'm with a lion shifter. He put a finger under her chin and raised her face to be sure she was looking into his eyes. You're with a lion shifter, for life. There's no going back. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. She sighed. I called my brother Rafe. I left him a message. Told him shit was hitting the fan. That's all you said? I never had a chance to call him again because then even more shit hit the fan. She traced tiny patterns in the hair on his chest. I have a plan. Chapter 16. Veila stretched, then opened her eyes. Her body ached from being on the rock all night. She reached out to put her arm across Mark's chest. Nothing. A boulder, semi-warm from the heating element. No Mark. She looked for his clothes, hoping he'd gotten up to stretch and his clothes were there. But they were gone too. What the fuck? She growled, knowing it was her tigress's sentiment as well. How could her tigress not notice he'd gotten up and left sometime during the night? She was pissed. Had Mark used her? She didn't think he was like that. Her tigress growled at Veila's thought process. What else could it be? The man was gone after a one-night stand. Should she just be happy she had a night of passion? It had been a long time since she'd had sex after all. No, she wasn't happy about that at all. She wasn't looking for a piece of ass, an easy lay. In fact, she wasn't looking for anything at all. Fucker. Her tigress snarled. Fuck you, too. Veila was pissed at the world now, including her tigress. Veila decided the best way to deal with her anger toward Mark was to be productive, and maybe to vent a little. First order of business. Sophie. Veila walked into Sophie's place using her code on the keypad. It was dark, and Sophie was exactly where Veila had figured she'd be, still in bed after closing after dark. It was only 9 o'clock in the morning after all. Veila strode into the bedroom where the shades had been pulled shut. She sat in the wing chair and waited. She had no doubt Sophie's tigress would let her know someone was in the room. Sophie's eyes fluttered open. She took a second to focus, then sat up. Hey. Her voice was sleep-muffled. Thanks for dumping Dad on me last night at after dark. Thanks for dicking me and Vax over yesterday. Father showed up, ready for heads to roll. At the meeting? Yeah, where else? And now Vax has quit. He and Callie packed and left. Sophie's face crumpled into an ugly cry. He quit? He can't quit. He didn't say goodbye or anything. Wait. This isn't about him saying goodbye to you. It's about us. All of us. Vax is gone, and I'm leaving. I'm sure Father will have you and Lila run after dark, and the rest of our business is here. Veila rose from the chair and began to pace from one end of the bedroom to the other, doing semicircles around the bed. What? The word came out as a long, drawn-out wail. You can't. Sure I can. Veila shrugged. She knew she was being a bitch and maybe overreacting toward her half-sister, but she'd had enough of her father. She hadn't had enough of Mark, but evidently he decided he had, since he'd left without a word or a note. Now, she wasn't going to watch her very best friend in the world, her big brother Vax, being dicked over by their father again. She was passing on that. I'm going to lie down. She headed for the front door. I didn't sleep last night. Tossing and turning? Sophie asked. If only it were so simple. Something like that. You know I can smell him. Sophie followed her into the front room. Veila whirled around, standing by the breakfast bar. Who? Fuck. Damn. She cursed herself for being so dumb. She should have showered first. Whoever you were tossing and turning with last night? There was no judgment in Sophie's tone. Tears erupted from Veila's eyes. I have to go. The words were torn from her throat in an attempt to keep from sobbing. She didn't want to talk about Mark. She didn't want to think about him. She'd been ready to bond with him last night. Please don't go. You can't break up the family like this. Can I do anything to help? Veila paused. Her heart went out to her little sister. They'd had such a good life when they all came here, and now things were going to shit. Maybe she owed it to all of them to be the leader, to take charge, to make something work. Tell May, Doc, and Lazar we can resume the meeting this evening if they want. If you see Dad, tell him—" Veila tapped on the granite countertop. Rat-tat-tat, her French manicured nails machine-gunned on the hard surface. "Just tell him—" Damn. She didn't know what to say. "I'll keep him busy," Sophie offered. "If you can buy me some time, that would be great. I need to figure out where the hell Vax is and bring him back. I don't want to run this place myself. This wasn't in the plans for me." Veila went to her apartment and crawled into bed. The scent of her passionate night with Mark was still on her body and in her nostrils. A set of hard ebony eyes and full lips crossed her mind. She smiled and then scowled. Chapter 17. Mark used the keycard to let himself into the hotel room. Mason lay on the bed, shirt off, in a pair of sweats. He flicked the remote, turning the TV off.
"Where the hell have you been? Your phone's off. I thought the Tieros had you. I called our guys in."
That was all Mark needed. Martinez security showing up on the Tieros' doorstep. That would take the feud to the next level.
"Oh, shit. Tell them to come here instead. Damn."
Mason sniffed, his nostrils flaring. His brows shot upward in a questioning look.
"So where were you?"
Mark chewed on his lip and strode to the window, where he pushed the curtain aside to look at the Dallas cityscape. He purposefully kept his face averted from Mason's scrutinizing gaze.
"I was talking to a friend."
A scoffing laugh came from behind him.
"Female?"
As if Mason couldn't smell.
"Yeah?"
Mark headed toward the bathroom. A shower should fix this issue, though he didn't want to wash her scent away.
"You motherfucker! You were getting laid while I worried you were fighting the Tieros?"
Mason didn't sound too angry, but his voice held a note of concern.
No, it's not like that. I wasn't getting laid."
Not just getting laid.
"I was talking to someone." "Sure you were. Right. Who were you talking to?" "Veila Tiero." "Sure you were. Yeah, right. And I was talking to Evie Arsenault."
Mason stumbled over Evie's name, a sure sign that saying her name still put a hitch in his throat. Mark turned to look at his brother so Mason could see the sincerity in his eyes.
"I really was. In Sanctuary." "Okay. I believe you, I guess."
Mason studied him suspiciously.
"What about the feud?"
Mark shrugged. Who gave a crap about some old men who'd been jilted ages ago?
"I need to do something to help her. She's in a jam." "They don't even want us here, and you want to help her?"
Mason nodded, but the way he nodded was as if he thought Mark had lost his senses.
"I know. It's crazy."
Mark ran his fingers through his hair, then scrubbed his hand over his face, the rough stubble making a scratchy sound.
"There's something about her." "Don't even think about it. They don't crossbreed. They don't interspecies mix. At all. They don't even like to have humans as mates." "I think there's going to be a change."
Chapter 18. Veila heard Vax's voice. It must have been a dream, because how could that be? That must have been what had awakened her. She heard it again. After rubbing the sleep out of her eyes, she leaped out of bed. That definitely sounded like Vax. She threw open her apartment door leading to the main hallway. Sophie. She was talking to... Rafe? Her half-brother Rafe turned around. "What are you doing here?"
"I got your message. Then Dad called. He asked me to come down here to run after dark."
The first thing Veila felt was a searing anger that burned through her body straight to her core. She wasn't supposed to run the club. She didn't want to. Hell no. But the slap in the face of his insult stung. She frowned. "So you're taking over?" Rafe didn't answer.
"Can someone tell me what the hell is going on? All Dad said is that Vax left."
"He was pretty much pushed to it. Father gave him an ultimatum. Veila realized she was waving her hands. Jeez, so Italian, just like her father after all. He has to make a choice. After Doc or Callie.
I guess it's clear what choice he made.
Rafe's expression darkened, his dark blue eyes turning indigo. Veila knew Rafe had fallen in love with Callie. Clearly, he still carried a torch for her. Exactly. Vax handed me the keys and walked out. They packed and left.
Then what?
Father told me I'd be taking over. She had never called their father Dad the way Rafe, Sophie, and Lila did. Probably because she had experienced a different side of him. She had noticed long ago Vax did the same.
So why the hell did Dad call me? Why am I here?
Rafe leaned back against the wall. His chest was still wide, his shoulders broad, but he seemed less vibrant, less alive. It was as though the love he had for Callie extinguished a certain light within Rafe. Veila mourned for her little brother. He was in the middle of a heartache. I don't know why he called you here. I guess he doesn't want me running things. Actually, you know what? Hang on. Veila slipped into her apartment and grabbed her keys off the counter. Take these. I don't want them. I'm obviously not worthy. She handed Rafe her keys. Tell them I'll move out within a week.
Holy shit,
Rafe hissed. No, Veila. Sophie's face crumpled. Veila slipped back into her room, closing the door behind her softly. For the first time in her life, she felt totally alone. All the siblings and half-siblings she had, and now she felt completely alone. And the most bizarre thing of all was she wished she had someone to talk to, someone to hold on to, someone who believed in her. And that someone was a lion with dark hair, charcoal eyes, and a body that was perfectly lickable. Chapter 19.
Are we going home or not?
You can, Mark told Mason. He pulled a black hoodie over his head. My reason for being here isn't over. Actually, it's changed. It certainly had changed. All that long blonde hair, those light eyes, a set of hips a man could hold on to, an ass that filled a pair of pants and then some, and a personality that didn't quit. That was his new reason for sticking around. He was going to get to know Veila. He was going to help her see she couldn't live without him. He left for the Tieros Towers, taking Mason's lockpicking kit with him. He'd never been as good at it as Mason, but surely he could manage to get in. Mark was in his lion skin. It was dark outside, and he was perfectly hidden in the back of the Tieros Towers parking garage. He leaped through the large concrete slats in the garage and landed on the ground. After shifting quickly in the event someone might drive by, he made for the elevator. A couple of clicks of the tumbler and a deft move with his wrist, and the elevator opened.
Huh. Maybe little brother isn't the only one with skills.
The doors closed behind him, giving him privacy. He surveyed the panel. Damn. Another lock to get to the right floor? He used the kit on that one and was rewarded with the whirring of the elevator as it rose to the 42nd floor where After Dark was located. The elevator stopped. A moment too late, Mark noticed he hadn't reached the 42nd floor. The red number said 36. Why? What? The door opened. Mark never had a chance to escape. 6 tiger shifters with another 6 behind them seized him. Tieros security. Chapter 20. Veila didn't answer her door. She didn't answer her phone. Her siblings quit knocking on the door, and then, a few hours later, they quit calling. It was futile anyway. She wasn't going to answer. Dressed in a pair of shorts and a tank top, she curled up on her couch with the last of the chocolate. Lila had left it on the counter for her before she and Cy left to take Petra back to Chicago. Veila praised and cursed Lila for leaving her in the lurch, but she couldn't blame her. Clearly, Lila was the smart one, getting out before things became inflamed. She flipped through the channels on the TV, but nothing could soothe her. Her phone vibrated. Her siblings didn't give up, did they? It was a text from Gavin. Odd. Why would Gavin text her? The next text read, "Need you to come to the 36th floor." Why would Gavin want her to go there? That floor was dedicated to the security team. It was where they'd detained Mark and his brother. Why would Gavin want her to go there? She texted him back. Why? His response was simple, but it answered no questions. Come, now. She cursed out Gavin in her mind, then yanked her shorts off and threw on some jeans, shimmying to get into the tight, unforgiving material. Damn. She should cut down on the chocolate. She would, as soon as she could cut down on the stress. Grabbing her keys and nothing else, she made for the elevator. If Gavin thought he was going to talk her into staying, if her father had coerced Gavin into getting her to go down there so he could talk to her, she was going to kill Gavin. She'd forget he was one of Vax's closest friends, and she'd kill him. Chapter 21. Mark stalked around the security room on the 36th floor.
What are you waiting for? Go ahead. Kill me. I heard about the Tieros, their views regarding other shifters. Just do it.
Shut up already, Gavin said. Killing you isn't in the plan. Not right now, anyway. The door opened, and a short, curvy shifter burst into the room. An Arctic fox shifter, Mark realized. She was teeming with excitement. Gavin, her face was animated. You won't believe what... She froze as she noticed the dozen Tieros security tiger shifters in the room, and, in their midst, one very angry, very out-of-place lion. Her gaze swung back to Gavin, her eyes wide. What's going on? Her voice was a tiny, nervous squeak. Nothing to worry about, Layla. Gavin's tone changed, his timbre deepening. Mark eyed Gavin suspiciously. Was there something between him and the Arctic fox shifter? I'll find you later, Gavin told her, then led her toward the door, his hand on her back. Interesting. The Tieros have a fox in their midst, in addition to a bear shifter and 2 wolf shifters. This wasn't the Tieros he knew by reputation. Not at all. As soon as Gavin had closed the door behind Layla, he turned toward Mark. Why did you break into Tiero Towers? Nothing to say? As if Mark would admit he'd come to see Veila. That would put a spotlight on her and bring her heat from her tribe. And clearly, with all she was going through, that was the last thing she needed. Get in. Gavin waved Mark toward the cell. This shit again? Mark studied the odds. 12-1. He sighed and went in, letting Gavin close the cell door behind him with a clang and a click of the key turning. Leave us, he told his team. Curious turn of events. Why would Gavin want to talk to him alone? Chapter 22. Veila raised her hand and made a fist to knock on the door, but it opened before she could touch it. She almost knocked on Gavin's forehead. His little trick of opening the door like that would get him a knot on his head if he wasn't careful. What's up? She leaned over and tried to glance around his shoulder, wondering if her father was there. He wasn't. But Mark was. And he was in the cage. What the fuck? She looked to Gavin for an answer. Was this where Mark had been all along? She was beginning to feel bad about the thoughts she'd had. I think I should leave you two to talk, Gavin said. There was a disturbance in Sanctuary. Gavin didn't have to finish his sentence. Veila knew the disturbance he was trying to allude to. Her night of passion with Mark. A heat rose to her cheeks, heralding the blush she knew was a dead giveaway to her guilty conscience about that night. "Thanks," she mumbled, keeping her head low. Gavin closed the door behind him. Veila raised her eyes to Mark's face, a face she'd committed to memory. Mark blinked. She wasn't a hallucination brought on by his wishful thinking. She was really there. Veila stood, legs shoulder-width apart, shoulders squared, ready for battle. Her face was pale, and her long blonde hair had that just fucked look. Mark couldn't take his eyes off every inch of her. She had a tank top on. Jesus Christ, his goddamn cock jerked to attention when he zeroed in on the soft swells beneath her tank top. The tips of her breasts poked out, needing attention, or at least that was how Mark wanted to interpret it. They needed his attention. He hadn't forgotten the taste of her nipples, of her beautiful pink and red sex when she'd come in his mouth. "Hey." Suddenly, Mark was disgusted with himself. Couldn't he come up with more of a greeting than "hey"? Like telling her he'd missed her, or how much she meant to him, or how awesome last night had been. "You vanished last night." Her tone seemed to be injected with Freon. Uh-oh, shit. Mark hadn't even thought about it from her perspective. Damn. "I was worried about creating problems for you being found there." He couldn't even put into words what he was thinking, not with so much blood still in his engorged cock. She shrugged, her brows raised, either not understanding or not buying his explanation, but her eyes traveled the length of his body, then centered on his lips. Mark liked that. His cock did too, and responded. So did his lion, giving a snarl of appreciation for the woman they loved. "I know how the Tieros feel about cross-mixing of species and stuff. Plus, I didn't want to sully your reputation." "What century do you live in, Mark Martinez?" She stormed forward, her face a passionate mask of indignation. Reaching between the bars, she grabbed the collar of his black hoodie and pulled him forward until his face was touching the bars. "That's bullshit. My reputation? Screw my reputation." She leaned in and kissed him, her eyes closed. She licked his lower lip, ventured her tongue into his mouth, testing, seeking, and finding. He let her take what she wanted, giving her what she needed. When she opened her eyes, there wasn't a hint of insecurity in them. She knew exactly what she wanted. He did too. "Let's go." He reached into his pocket for the lock-picking kit, then noticed the key was already in the door. Gavin had left it there. The head of Tieros security knew a lot more than it seemed. As soon as the cell was open, he reached for her, running his hands along her sides, her curves, up her bare arms, enjoying the goosebumps he was raising on her flesh. "I want you in my life. I'm not going to play games or do any other kind of hoop-jumping shit. I want you. I know you want me. Your tigress wants me. Can we just cut through the bullshit and get to the place where we're together?" Veila loved Mark's straight talk. She loved that he put himself and his emotions on the line and made himself vulnerable. "I have a few things to sort out." "Your father?" "Yeah." She nodded, laying her head on his chest. "I wish I could do all that for you. Take care of it and let you not be stressed." The door creaked open. Gavin walked in. Veila looked at him. She was willing to bet the timing of his entrance wasn't coincidental. "You were listening," she accused Gavin without sounding critical. "You act like I can help it. It's super sensitive, you know, the hearing thing." She also knew he was highly rated in the hearing department. Gavin nodded at Mark. "I had a good feeling about you. Glad I wasn't wrong." He turned back to Veila. "I'd like to help with this." "What do you mean?" "It's time for a change, and I think you're the one who can pull it off," he told Veila. "I'll back you. Veila was confused. Why? You're from the old regime. Why would you want to see the old codes changed?
No, my father was, and I'll tell you a secret.
He lowered his voice.
Vax and Callie are at my place.
What? Joy soared in Veila's heart. I thought they left.
Nope.
Veila sat on the bar stool in front of the countertop desk. She grabbed a pen and began to doodle, trying to bring things together in her mind. A few seconds later, she began a rhythmic tapping of her nails on the counter. Gavin. She whirled the chair around, her face animated. Tell everyone a meeting has been called. I don't care who you have to lie to or what lie you have to tell them. Just get them there.
Will do.
Chapter 23. Veila waited in the executive boardroom. She sat in her usual spot across from Vax's seat at the long table. Mark sat on her right. Next to him were May and Doc. The Nielsen twins, Rory and Reese, sat across from May and Doc. Lazar was to the left of Vax's spot. His sisters, Alexa and Evie, had returned to their home in New Orleans, and he'd conveyed their apologies. Veila knew it had something to do with Mark's brother. She would ask him about that one day, but today was dedicated to other matters, chiefly her brother and the rest of her family. Lila and Sai had finally returned and were seated next to Lazar. Sai's sister Petra had been settled back in Chicago, and they'd been brought up to speed on the events they'd missed. Veila felt like she was holding her breath. Would he come? She had no way of knowing for sure. The door opened a crack. She tried to see who it was, but until it was opened farther, she had no way of knowing. Her lungs burned from holding her breath. Why weren't they opening the damn door? Finally, it swung all the way open. Vax. She was so happy to see him she wanted to get up and dance. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each shifter, his gaze finally resting on Veila.
I didn't know everyone would be here. Gavin said you wanted to talk.
I do. Have a seat. She waved him toward his usual spot. Vax eyed the chair suspiciously, as if there might be a rattlesnake in it. He stepped forward into the room. Callie was behind him. You're next to him. Veila indicated the empty chair to the right of Vax's chair. Vax closed the door behind Callie and glanced at Gavin.
So you're party to this too?
Leaning against the wall, Gavin raised a brow, but said nothing. Vax took his seat, nodding at Lazar and May, then the rest of the table.
Greetings, all.
His voice was low. The door opened again, and Rafe strode in. He saw Vax and smiled. Then he noticed Callie, and the smile vanished, replaced by confusion for a moment until he composed himself. Rafe glanced at Veila as if he couldn't believe she'd put him in this position. She tried to convey her apology with her eyes. She had no wish to hurt her baby brother, even though he and Vax had spent so many years at odds with one another. Rafe looked away, choosing instead to keep his gaze on the windows and the Dallas skyline. They didn't have long to wait for the final step in her plan to fall into place. The door opened again, this time to reveal her father and her uncles Tito and Federico, all of whom wore their business suits, including crisply knotted neckties. Her father's face was grim. Giovanni strode into the room, letting Tito close the door behind him. His bearing was straight and proud.
You said you needed a short time to think. It has been much more than a short time.
Shit. He'd called Rafe in. He had no intention of waiting to hear what she had to say. He'd bypassed her completely. In all the craziness that had ensued, Veila had forgotten the way she'd left things. Giovanni greeted Rafe with a hug, then waved his hand around the room, indicating those who had gathered, clearly frustrated by the other species and the human. Finally, he turned to Veila.
I see the lesson I've taught your brother Vittorio hasn't taken seed in your mind yet. I'm glad I called your brother Raphael."
Veila took a deep breath and rose from her seated position. "I'm done with this. The old codes, the old ways, and the old feuds are over."
"You do not determine what is over and what is not. This is Tieros territory. I determine that. Give me the keys. You are fired."
Next to her, Mark rose to his feet. She felt him bristling, his lion ready to rampage to protect his mate. He took her hand, put his arm around her. Heads snapped in their direction. The only one not shocked by Mark's actions was Gavin. Veila put her hand on Mark's. "I've got this," she whispered close to his ear, leaving a gentle silent kiss on his cheek beneath his temple. Giovanni scoffed.
"A Martinez is going to assist a Tieros? Don't make me laugh. Raphael, it is your show. You run this continent, and I will run Europe."
Rafe stood. He turned glittering indigo eyes toward Vax, then looked at his father.
"No."
Giovanni sputtered briefly.
"Fine. I will handle this continent, and you can run all of Europe."
Rafe looked at Veila, then at their father again.
"No."
His voice was more firm than the first time he'd said it. Red-faced, Giovanni began to shift, stripes showing through his skin. Tito and Federico both put their hands on his arms.
"Gio, no!"
Federico exclaimed. Giovanni paused to shift.
"What the hell is so wrong with you, Raphael?"
His voice was inhuman in his mid-shifted state. He gave Rafe a look of disdain and turned to Gavin.
"You and your men need to cease." "No, sir."
Gavin told Gio, then looked at Veila.
"Do you want them removed?"
He indicated Giovanni, Tito, and Federico. Giovanni's face became splotchy and red, his features distorted into a scowl, eyebrows drawn down.
"Removed? Me? Do you forget who I am?"
he roared. Vax stepped forward.
"Who are you? You're an old man who made some bad decisions and is losing more than his children. So much more."
He took Callie's hand in his. Giovanni looked at his brothers.
"Can you believe this?"
Tito cleared his throat, adjusted his tie.
"Maybe the young ones have a point. Even you, Raphael?"
Giovanni asked Rafe, clearly not believing his favorite would turn on him.
"Especially me."
Rafe looked at Vax, his intent clear.
"You damaged something precious, and I'm guilty of letting you."
Tears streamed down Callie's face. Veila knew the brothers' reconciliation was high on Callie's priority list, and had been since she and Vax first bonded. Callie rose to her feet, tiny compared to Vax, but there was something about her today that seemed so very different. It made her seem imposing. "Mr. Tieros." Callie's voice was strong and unwavering, even though her face was damp with her sorrow. "I hope for your grandchild's sake you will change your mind about a few things, and change your ways as well." The beautiful curvy brunette held her stomach, turned, and stepped away, waving to Vax. "I'm going to the restroom. This has been taxing. I'll be right back. You stay and sort things out with your family." Giovanni stepped aside so she could pass. Veila indicated to Gavin to have several of his men accompany her. Gavin nodded and sent 3 of them after her. Veila turned to Vax. "Really?" she mouthed. "Pregnant?" Vax nodded. "I'm going to be an aunt." She whispered to Mark, then wondered why the hell she'd whisper in a room full of shifters. They all heard her. Rafe looked at Vax.
"Congratulations."
Immobile, Giovanni didn't utter a word. "You have a decision to make, Father," Veila said. "Meeting adjourned." The shifters left the room one by one, single file. Other than Giovanni and his brothers, Veila was the last to leave. She glanced back at her father. He resembled a forlorn, broken man. Chapter 24. Mark and Veila were in the elevator, heading toward her apartment. She was subdued and completely turned inward, as if contemplating something huge. Knowing her history with her father, he couldn't blame her. Mark wished he could make it all perfect for her.
Now what?
He twined his fingers in her hair, pulling her head back, leaning forward, and studying her eyes. The tigress in her was sending carnal signals, lighting a fire in the depths of Veila's eyes that the lion in Mark couldn't help but respond to. "I need you." Her voice was tinged with their tigress's. He could tell from her scent she wanted him. He touched her cheek, running the backs of his fingers along her smooth skin, filling his lungs with her essence. He wanted to tell her again how much he wanted her, how he only wanted her. Only her for the rest of their days. His wish was to spend his days learning her curves, worshipping the body he'd barely had a chance to explore. The elevator dinged their arrival on Veila's floor. He didn't move. His eyes feasted on the slope of her cheeks, the way her lips curved upward when she was thinking pleasant thoughts.
"There's a storm coming,"
he mentioned. She'd told him she loved watching the storms from the rooftop. It appealed to the base part of her to be out in the middle of a raging storm, completely at the mercy of nature's forces. "Let's go." Her voice was only partially human, the tigress taking control. One flick of the key, and 2 minutes later, they were in the glass room that opened up to the rooftop. Veila stopped in front of the glass, watching the storm rage around them. The wind whipped the trees in the landscaped garden. The hot tub's water swished and reflected the lightning. Mark wrapped his hands around her waist, pressing his body against her back. He could see how she loved her home, especially the rooftop and sanctuary. He'd hate to take her away from this, especially when he had his own territory to manage. He inhaled the scent of lavender in her hair. It merged with the musk, spurring him to a desire that was quickly becoming evident and hard. He'd never met a woman who made his body and heart respond to this degree, and so damn quickly. Her scent grew stronger as she realized his need. Veila arched her back, pushing her full ass into the manifestation of his desire, coaching him with the promise of the sleekness she offered. Pressing hard against her ass, his insistent cock swelled even more. Mark took her by the hips and pulled her closer, grinding his hardness into her body.
"Is there a way to lock the door so no one can disturb us?"
he whispered in her ear. "Yes." Her hiss was low as she twisted away from him. She fiddled with the elevator's door, then reached for his hand and turned the handle on the entrance leading outside.
"Wait."
He quickly pulled her clothing off her body, marveling at her full curves, ready to take her. "Now you wait." Veila tugged on his pants, undressing him in record time. "Ready?" Excitement glittered in her eyes, gold flecks in her irises reflecting her exhilaration. He nodded. Veila pulled the door open, the wind whipping her hair all around her face. She ran into the rain and stood in front of a tree, her hair now soaked, drops sliding down her body, shining in the reflection of the lightning. Veila pushed her hair away from her face, her breasts bouncing their fullness with the motion. Mark ran his thumbs over the dark pink nipples, taking each one between his thumb and fingers, rolling them, pulling them out, and pinching them. Veila moaned, arching her breasts forward, her body begging for more. He took a nipple in his mouth and laved it with his tongue, flicking it, sucking it in deep, then scraping his teeth over it, while one of his other hands lavished the other nipple with attention, tugging and rolling it. The scent of her sex was too much to resist. He slipped a finger between the wet folds of her nether lips, caressing her swollen clit, using slow, firm circles. Veila's hips tilted. Her hands were talons digging into his shoulders as he increased his speed. His fingers traveled, entering her slickened sex, sucked in by her moisture and tightness. She moaned as 2 digits penetrated her inner lips, spreading her legs more. Mark thumbed her clit while his other hand pulled and pinched on her nipples. She let out a long moan, and her muscles tightened around his fingers, making him dart them in and out faster and faster. "Oh, Mark!" Her exclamation made him want to take her, to make her his forever, marked with his love. He wanted her to be sure, and he wasn't willing to rush her into anything she didn't want fully. "Oh, Mark, please," she panted. Christ. Her moans weren't helping his self-restraint. His cock throbbed to be inside her, the pulse beating a primal rhythm in his body. His thrusting fingers became wild, pumping into her faster and faster. He added another finger, stretching her tight sheath around his digits, her moisture sliding down his hand, the slurpy noises making him want to sample the taste of her again. He could never tire of her flavor, the essence of it, and the scent of it. She threw her head back, her mouth wide in a primal yell, dug her fingers into his chest, her nails long and lethal, and came undone with a violent tremor, screaming her rapture, arching into it, clamping around his fingers, holding them still with the muscles in her channel. "I love you." Veila's words were such a low whisper, Mark wondered if he'd really heard them. He looked into the depths of her eyes, saw the insecurity there, the kind that had taken years to develop, probably all of it courtesy of her father. A part of him was angered to the point of violence that this beautiful, vibrant woman's self-esteem had been damaged by her father. It was a miracle she wasn't a basket case, an amazing feat she was as well put together as she was. He kissed her lips tenderly, leaving his on hers while she panted her passion away. Chapter 25. Veila shuddered, another aftershock from her orgasm. She tried to control her breathing while her muscles were still tight around Mark's fingers. Had he heard her say those words? Was that okay? He leaned in to kiss her, his lips lingering. Was this his way of avoiding responding to her confession? She glanced away. She shouldn't worry about things like that, but she couldn't stop. "Hey." Mark's tone was low as her words had been. He put his finger under her chin, tilting her face a little more. He pulled back. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his. Mark's pupils swirled with his lion's gold flecks. "You're the one I want, the only one I've ever wanted. I'll spend the rest of my days showing you and telling you." Tears filled her eyes. Veila wanted to look away, but Mark's gaze was so intense she couldn't. She remained locked on to him. She barely knew him, but it was as if she'd always known him, as if he'd always been a part of her. She didn't need to know anything else about him but this. Everything Mark was made Veila crazy with passion. His kisses, the way he knew how to work her body. Her tigress growled at her, telling her she was a fool if she didn't see what this man was to her, and that he felt the same way. Her tigress took charge, taking the reins, guiding her in the right direction. "I want you to be mine," she told Mark, her voice husky, enjoying the look that passed over his face. Her man, her lion, the fierce protector who believed in her and was willing to let her lead and be the woman she needed to be. Mark combed his fingers through his hair, now dark waves framing a face that looked as if it belonged to a Roman statue. He took a step toward the hot tub, his body gleaming with the rain, his muscles flexing and unflexing with every motion. A body like that needed to be licked and adored. Her inner muscles throbbed all over again with leftover spasms and renewed lust for his hardness. When he swiveled to glance back at her, she saw the silhouette of his hardness, full, thick, ready. She had to have it. Him, inside of her, now. Her tigress propelled Veila forward, She stalked his way and wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers buried in his wet hair, the wind whipping at them both. The rain beat down on them, drenching their already soaked bodies. Veila pulled his head down, taking his lips prisoner, her tongue parting them, claiming them. Mark's hand snaked around her, pressing his erection against her tummy, his arms like steel braces keeping her captive and safe, both at the same time. Mark's body was beyond sexy. His muscles jumbled her thoughts until all she could think about was him, his sex, his body. Between them, his stiffness called to her. "I need you." Those words came from her tigress, but they spilled out of Veila's mouth.
"Touch me."
Mark's voice was low, almost inhuman, or more than human, perhaps. His lion was taking charge, responding to her tigress. Veila lowered her hand, her fingers skimming over his wide chest, the downy hairs that proclaimed his masculinity, the rippling abs that flexed instinctively as she traveled over them. She was almost there, almost at her target, his springy curls brushing her fingertips. Braving more, she took his length in her hands, grasping him tightly, her fingers coursing up the hardness of his rod until she reached the very tip. She felt the pre-cum, so different than the rain falling on them, thick and creamy. Running her thumb over the cream, she spread it around the head of his cock, then under the rim of it, making slow, leisurely circles. She trailed a fingernail gently along the underside. Her tigress felt his pulse quicken. When she dropped her other hand to cup his testicles, his sharp intake of breath made a flood grow between her legs. She lowered herself to her knees and put the tip of her tongue on his slit, tasting the saltiness and yumminess before the rain could take it from her. His grunt was her reward until she put her lips around the tip of him, sealing his head in her mouth, her lips wrapped around the rim of it. He let out a loud hiss.
"Fuck!"
Veila looked up at him. His face was tight with desire, his jaws clenched. Flecks of golden amber glowed in the depths of his eyes.
"Veila."
He sucked air in, his chest filling, the muscles expanding.
"I can't wait. I need to make you mine. Now. I'm too close."
Mark pushed her forward, bending her over, his knees pressed against the outside of the raised hot tub, her hands propping her body. He spread her legs with his knees and a rocking of his hips. His hardness pressed against her entrance, and his hands played on her back, pressing her downward, making her ass push up. His cock entered her quickly, pushed in with the ferocity of a waiting lion. A rush of air escaped Veila's lips at the fullness.
Fuck, you're so tight,"
he muttered, his words punctuated by groans with every stroke as he pulled his length out and pushed back in. A clap of thunder cracked, making Veila jump, her sheath clamping down on his hardness, holding him in place. He responded by pulling out and grabbing her hips, then pummeled her, punishing her pussy with his girth while pleasing her G-spot with every stroke. Veila leaned backward, arching her back, pressing into him, enjoying the feeling of his testicles slapping her lips, the sound of his panting breaths taking her farther into the abyss that left her body in spasms. "So close, Mark." She whispered the words, but his lion's hearing picked them up, as she knew it would.
"Come for me. Now, baby. Take me with you."
His voice was gruff and demanding, colored by desire. "Make me yours," she begged. "Now, forever. I want to be yours."
"Be sure, because there's no going back. I play for keeps. I love you, Veila. Be sure."
Every word was followed by a thrust. "Now!" she screamed, her channel flexing and milking him, pulling him in deeper. The sting of Mark's bite on her shoulder was washed away by the pleasure of his tongue licking at it, slightly rough, a sign his lion was joining him. Mark's body jerked behind her as he held her close. She felt his hot essence filling her body, pulsating against her sleek inner muscles. Later, Mark and Veila sat in the hot tub. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, her back resting on his chest. The storm had lessened, and the rain was falling gently, the wind almost gone. Mark pushed her hair aside and traced patterns on her shoulder, next to the spot where he'd marked her. His touch made shivers travel along her body. He kissed her mark.
"Where are we going to live? I'm an alpha. I can't just abandon my life."
She'd been afraid this would come up. She didn't know what they would do. "I can't either."
"Well, we'd better figure out a way to work this out. We've bonded, and even if we hadn't, I'd kill any man who touched you."
Epilogue. Veila held Mark's hand and looked around Sophie's apartment. Vax and Callie, Lila and Sai, and Sophie were all there. "Father's here. He wants to talk to all of us," Sophie told them.
"Where's Rafe?"
Vax asked. "He went back home." Veila didn't want to say it was too hard for Rafe to be around Callie. "He had to take care of some business." Vax nodded. She wondered if he knew. They walked to the executive boardroom. Veila half felt as though she were walking to the gallows. Was their father going to drop a bomb on them? Their father stood at the other end of the room. The window overlooking Dallas's evening skyline served as a backdrop. Giovanni looked different. Tito and Federico flanked him as always.
"I'm not always right. In fact, this time I've been very wrong. I hope each of you finds it in your heart to forgive me."
He walked to the door, leaving all of his children open-mouthed. Veila walked Mark to the rooftop. Outside, another storm was raging, matching her emotions inside. A part of her felt pity for her father's emotional downslide. The other part of her couldn't feel pity for the man who could have done so much more for her and Vax.
"What do you think?"
Mark asked her. "I think I'd like to visit Florida sometime soon. But until I do, can Mason run your show for you?"
"Of course. What's on your mind?"
"There's a storm brewing." This has been Adversary, Shifters Forever Worlds, Always After Dark, Book 3. Written by Elle Thorne. Narrated by Megan Kelly. Copyright 2015 by Elle Thorne. Production copyright by Elle Thorne.